morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from around the world. This is day 2 of our Smart Regions virtual workshop. Thanks so much for joining us, especially if you were able to join us yesterday. Just wanted to quickly introduce our first panel for the day, how smart cities can become pandemic resilient. And I will pass it over to Matthew James Bailey, who will be our moderator for this session. Go ahead, Matthew.
Thank you, Macy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the panel on how can smart cities become pandemic resilient. And it's really important at the moment as we venture into the new normal. I'm Matthew James Bailey, author of Inventing World 3.0, which is a playbook for nations, regions, and societies and cities to innovate their future partnership with artificial intelligence. And there are 3 chapters dedicated on how we can create pandemic resilient societies using AI. But we're not here to talk about the book. We're here to be joined by wonderful experts that will help you as city managers or in City Hall or in businesses or even running alliances on how to innovate the new normal. And today we're joined by some wonderful experts. First of all, we're joined by Jean Rice, who is the Senior Broadband Specialist and many other things at NTIA. We're also joined by NASA, believe it or not, with a genius called Yuri Gordiak, who is the Director of Airspace Operations and Safety Programs. And we're going to ground into Wilfred Pennifold, who is the CEO of Urban Systems. So today we have a wonderful, wonderful panel that will help you to understand how to innovate the future into the new normal. So if you want to read people's bios, you can look at the GCTC event website and you can see just how credible and wonderful these individuals are. So let's kick off and let's not wait around. Let's put the first question to Jean. Good morning, Jean.
Good morning, Matthew.
So Jean, would you like to share the latest innovations you're seeing in smart cities and smart regions to move into the new normal? And maybe you can share what NTIA are up to.
Oh, well, that's a great question. And of course, we always like to talk about what the latest innovations are. I guess one of the things that we've been focusing on is rural areas. We want to look at how to improve food production, through smart agriculture and precision ag, and through rural prosperity. So, some of the innovations that they actually will be hearing about somewhat today, I just want to point out a couple in the rural area. One would be the Wabash Heartland Innovation District. They just put up an aerostat so that they could cover 11 counties with LORAN to do basically to work with their corn crops. And it's very exciting. And also Purdue there, who works with that project, also has like new 3D printers that are doing sensors that are just will be incredibly cheap when they came out for ag. So we see some real invention happening there. We also see food safety tracking. So I say in the rural area is an area we work on a lot, and we work with the Smart Ag and Rural Supercluster, who has a workshop later today. We also kind of work on developing communities of interest because we do believe in the collaborative model. So we work with smart states, with the National Governors Association. We also have a state broadband leaders network. We feel that connectivity and inclusion is important, so the states deal with that, but also they're dealing with, interoperable data hubs. They're looking at how do they include the public. There's a whole host of pieces. And I have to say, we also kind of look at a holistic view. So when we're looking at smart cities and communities, a lot of cities and regions start looking about just the public sector. But we want to see things like smart buildings, and we have a super cluster on that that's just done a blueprint, kind of how do you think about bringing in the private sector. So we work on those pieces. We also work diligently on broadband, getting broadband to areas that aren't, and affordable broadband in areas where it is, let's say, unable in large cities for vulnerable populations to gain it. Then on a broader scale, NTI is definitely working on making more spectrum available and trying to promote 5G. And so and we also have like a science unit that does a lot of detailed research. Some of it is also about human experience, not just what does the tech do. So, I think we're doing a lot, and I just am always excited to hear about the innovations and kind of work like with the Smart Regions Collaborative on these collaboratives, because I think we learn more and we fail less if we work together.
That's wonderful, Jean. Thank you very much. And my goodness, what a broad range of topics from, and one thing we've learned is the well-being of our immune systems. And you've talked about smart ag. And then also the pandemic has kind of exposed the shortfall in equity and connectivity, hasn't it?
Yes.
So you've covered that too. So that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much. So Wilfred, good morning. You're muted.
Always the way to start the day.
It's nice to hear another British accent. So Wilfred, would you like to talk a little bit about urban systems? I know you're the CEO. I know they're doing some wonderful things. Would you like to share some of the latest innovations that you're seeing in smart cities around pandemic resilience a little bit, please?
Yeah, and I probably like Jean, I would probably go broader than just sort of focusing on the current pandemic. Though there are a number of things that we've learned from this pandemic that will help us in sort of future shocks that we expect. It's hard to know what the next hit will be. Obviously, this summer we've had to deal with the pandemic. I'm based up here in Portland, and we've had smoke from wildfires. I think the whole West Coast has suffered from wildfires. You know, we're along a fault. So resilience across the board is important, I think, for our communities. You know, talking about the pandemic itself, clearly the ability to be able to do contact tracing in a way that doesn't violate privacy would be hugely beneficial at the moment. And understanding how to deploy that kind of technology rapidly would help us in whatever the future event is. I think there are, you know, obviously a number of learnings. I thought Jean was exactly right about things like connectivity, clearly having multiple ways to continue our businesses. And it's worked very well for a whole segment of society. I think we were very fortunate that in this area, particularly that a lot of our business, you know, companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Intel, were able to move quite rapidly to isolate. And of course, if you can isolate sections of the population, that helps the rest. It helps the first responders, you know, do what they have to do, even though they have to get out in it. The fact that that the roads are less clogged and things. So I think resilience is having multiple pathways to achieve things. I think one lesson that I feel we may learn, I don't want us to learn, is how not to be so social. I think we need to get back to being social. I think a lot of us feel a little cooped up and would really like to get out. But I think there are ways to make that kind of community a positive, right? That we, you know, in communities we have rallied. You know, I've noticed being out on the streets here how courteous people are. I mean, I know there's different views about how to limit the spread of this virus, but I've noticed being out how courteous people are, how careful they are about giving you your 6 feet, how they wear masks. You know, every now and then I go out without my mask and quickly turn around and come back in, and I've noticed other people doing the same thing. Even just in the building I live in, people are trying to be courteous and not spread. But I think from a smart city perspective, the idea that we move more into community-oriented infrastructure around things like live, work, play could allow us in the future to be more sustainable at the local level. You know, whether you talk about it in the context of circular economy, whether you talk about it in the context of resilience or live, work, play, all of these mechanisms allow us to be a little more self-sufficient as a community. And I think that working on that, not taking that as an alternative to our global view, which I think has been incredible, but in crisis situations, for communities to be more resilient internally is critical. And we see a lot of that. We're working on a number of developments that include things like smart grids, that include things like, you know, water recycling, that include waste management, that are moving towards more circular economy. And when you look at circular economy, it's true that those circles go sometimes quite globally, but you have to know where they are. You have to know, you know, where the things that you're bringing into your community are coming from and where the things that are leaving your community are going. And when you know that, then you know quite quickly in a crisis what you have to deal with. You know, these items are not available locally. We're either going to have to figure out how not to use them for the next, you know, X number of months, or we're going to have to figure out how to get them from somewhere else. And our ability to be able to understand those cycles and follow that information, understand those logistics paths, that requires considerable amount of knowledge that smart cities can bring us. And it can help us in all sorts of ways in providing better services at lower cost and being able to make sure that we limit our carbon use. Those things come from those, understanding those cycles, managing them from end to end.
That's fantastic, Wilf. Absolutely fantastic view of smart cities. And there's so much richness in there. There's a lot for us to dive into there a little bit later. So thank you very, very much. So Yuri, good morning.
Good morning, Matthew.
So welcome from NASA. I can see you've got your NASA badge on your shirt, which is fabulous. So Yuri, talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in the latest innovations in smart cities and regions that you think is important for pandemic resilience, and maybe talk a little bit about what NASA are doing to help with that.
Sure. One of the main areas we're focused on now is actually urban air mobility. So that's both enabling commuting by air, but also drones. We're working with the FAA, and you can see micro deliveries there. So, you know, as many people have tried to be more cautious about interacting, being able to have micro deliveries would be an added benefit, and working quickly and getting things on a faster scale. We're also looking at building integration with multimodal systems, so to make the flows through cities more efficient. And that's really required us to go to sort of the digital twin technology to be able to model the buildings, the different modes of interaction, and predicting passenger flows and then disruptions. So having that ability, I think, has enhanced both the traffic management flow, but then also planning. And another aspect that we saw, especially as we're trying to now model buildings to have multiple uses interacting with smart transportation and other factors, is just the whole ability to reconfigure them. If you recall, you know, in Wuhan, they had to build external hospitals to handle the COVID crisis. But, you know, we could see a future where we can reconfigure buildings that they're designed, architected that way to begin with, and then maybe reconfigure them to handle disruptions, either floods or pandemics, or for leisure situations. It's kind of interesting when you look in DC, where I work, you know, after 5 o'clock, the area becomes almost a ghost town, right? When the federal workforce leaves, all those buildings are just there for work, and they're kind of a wasted space when you think about the city as a, you know, a center of so many things. But a reconfigurable system might allow us to have a much more usable space for different activities and modes, and resilience to different disruptions and impacts.
That's absolutely fantastic. So who would have thought that NASA is doing so much in helping digital twin and with all the modeling for cities and regional managers to actually get their transportation right and their multimodal mobility using models. And we'll dive into simulations a little bit in supercomputing. Thank you, Yuri. That's wonderful. So as you can see, audience, there is a rich amount of content here that these three individuals are bringing, which is fantastic. So let's go back to Jean. Jean, what do you think are the important strategies and things to put in place for cities and regions to move towards this new normal? You've spoken about agriculture and well-being. You've spoke about connectivity. What do you think are the important things for cities and regions to put in place?
You know, I have to say, Matthew, I think about it kind of as the 4 Ps: people-centric design, partnerships, participation, and privacy. And I just want to go into those a little bit. One is the people-centric design, and the idea is every community is different, and what can you do to improve people's lives? Clearly, we found with the the pandemic, need for telehealth, continued need for education online, and maybe a change in how workforce is going to happen in the future. So I think the key there is to kind of people-centered design that is based on the community's strengths. So for example, you'll see, the state of Arizona, they have a kind of a innovative area where they're looking at transportation. They're now having several regions, and they're also going to focus on some part of it in transportation. So it just depends on what the skill is, whether it's water quality or if it's public safety. But I think that design is important. Partnerships. I mean, I think that if you take a look at any of the slides for any of the smart regions that we've been seeing, we'll see later on, it is based on a huge amount of partnerships, university partnerships, community and stakeholder partnerships, and industry partnerships. And those, I think, are the key, those are key, and it works for connectivity, it works for inclusion, it works for any vertical that you have. Then it comes to participation. That is kind of, how do you engage the citizens to make decisions? Because you don't want to have as one community, have a network that they can't use because the citizens don't want to have it being used. So it's kind of like you have to be very careful to bring them involved, and you have to be cautious about how do you bring them involved and how do they make decisions? Can you do some co-design with different groups as you go forward? What are the pieces that you might put together for participation? The next is inclusion. And if you haven't had broadband, you're going to need training in how to do it and what to use. And that kind of leads into workforce development. But what we don't want to see is housing units that don't know how to take advantage of all of the pieces that are coming forward for public safety, for education, for health, all the pieces that come together. And you want to make sure every community can access it. So that's one of the reasons I do like smart regions, because in the participation area, they can be sure by aggregating demand that they don't leave any community behind. And then my last one is privacy. It always goes with cybersecurity, but I don't think it gets enough attention because I think privacy is key to a trusted environment. And it's important that the public trust the process and that you make your decisions, and for local governments, it's as close as, if you're having a camera on the street, what information does it keep and what information does it go right away? And I just a plug for AI, this is going to help in the future in those regards. But anyway, I think those are kind of key to looking at foundations that will lead to that resiliency that we want to see.
That's great, Jean. So the 4 Ps are the future for resiliency, and what a lot of rich content in there. When we talk about region, I think we do need to take a regional point of view, don't we? The Smart Cities Alliance yesterday announced one of your Ps, a multi-stakeholder of research, private business and cities coming together to develop an advanced mobility platform that was data-centric. And so I think that is an absolutely beautiful comment. And when it comes to privacy, that's why I put in the new book, Inventing World 3.0, new data ethic and certification models for cities to move the trust paradigm in transparency to the citizens, because what we're seeing is the digital world is starting to become a key partner in the future of our transformation into the new normal, isn't it? So those are wonderful points. Excuse me, Wilfred, I know that you're passionate about the gig economy, and I know that you have great views around the circular economy. Would you like to share more about that and why you think that's important and how that's going to become maybe part of the new normal in this new pandemic resilient smart city infrastructure and experience? Yeah,
thanks, Matthew. Actually, I'll also build a little bit on Jean's comments. I thought they were really good. The idea of a circular economy is tricky for a number of reasons, and so we want to address them correctly. First of all, it's really understanding where the materials are in your community, because if we're in a mine, use, dispose world, we know where the materials are. They're in the ground. We use them and then we get rid of them. And that's a fairly straightforward process. If we want to reuse those materials, we have to know where they are in our communities and whether they're at a point at which we can now reuse them if we want to move forward. So that sort of builds this cycle. But sort of to the 4 Ps as Jean outlined them, there's a pattern there that does start to play off that engagement, how we bring people in, because now those materials are spread throughout society, and we need people to say, hey, I've got something that I'm ready to, to recycle or to reuse or to move on. Participation, everybody has to understand that they are part of this. They're part of either the solution or the problem. They're either finding those materials from within the community and using them, or they're not, and they're creating waste. I think there's this sort of creates an engagement. I was talking earlier about the idea that these resilient communities have the ability to sustain themselves independently when they need to. It's not the idea of cutting those, of isolating themselves. It's an idea of creating alternative paths that are local, that you can rely on in crisis. And that kind of participation creates some challenges around things like ownership of data and privacy. And I'm just trying to think of the best way to frame this. There is an inherent challenge between the idea of customizing services for individuals and their privacy, right? And it's there. We know if we go into a community and we want everything tailored to ourselves, then that community needs to know who we are at some level of depth. And so we need to create a virtual world that has the same kinds of rules, laws, and norms as our physical world. And today we're very new to that, right? We don't understand it. So, we talk about privacy, but privacy is tied back to all the other 3 Ps, right? That if you want participation, people have to have something to participate with. They need to own their own data. They need to have agency over their data. And it's very fundamental to things that our society has developed. If you go back to anything, the right of search and seizure. If I see a lot of states talking about writing documents that talk about how they're going to treat your data, well, that they're going to protect it and they're going to look after it. And the problem with all of that is good and it's moving in the right direction, but it's not good enough, right? I do not want someone else holding my data. It destroys my agency, right? I need to hold my data in the same way as, I'm in my study at the moment and I own these things, and nobody, even the government, can come in and just take things. They have to have reason. Now, if all of those things in the virtual world reside on some data lake at some central location, I no longer have that privacy. I no longer have that agency. I can no longer say, that's my book and I will decide what to do with it. I say, oh, that's my document. It's at the hospital. And I have to go through all sorts of complex things to get at it. And that's problematic. It takes away my agency. So I think those 3 Ps actually weave together. And they're part of getting people to participate, giving them agency, allowing them the kind of privacy. And privacy, I think, is not a strong enough word. It needs to be an understanding that if you lose your privacy, you lose your agency, you lose your ability to be a valued part of the community. And so those things go together. I like the way you framed it, Gina. That was very, very well structured.
Thanks very much, Wilfred, for those wise observations. In my view, Wilf, I think we have to look at putting an ethical foundation into the digital world, which is what you're speaking about. And that's why I believe that new types of data ethics and classification is needed that create new trust paradigms and governance paradigms for the individual to have complete trust and transparency over where their data is used, right? Because we don't have that today. And you probably watched The Social Dilemma, didn't you? And that's quite concerning about how we're kind of being manipulated by the digital world and things like that. So those beautiful conversations. Thank you very much. And there's so much in there, isn't there, Wilf? Because I think what you're saying is that it's time for democracy in the digital world that's in the physical world to be reflected there. And that's what I call digital democracy. And that's a big transition for us. Thank you.
Matthew, if I might, I just wanted to mention, I think that privacy and the whole ethics component is important. And you brought up really clearly in your book on AI and other ways. But I have to say that I do think that's an area in smart cities we need to develop. We have a group of ethicists working on it for the Global Cities Team Challenge at the moment. But I do feel like it is one of those missing kind of elements. I mean, we do see like IEEE has their own standards for that, but we don't see the ethical standards as kind of a foundational part. So that's, I think, an important piece.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful, Jean. And Yuri, we will get to you in a moment, but this is a very important conversation, because this is what I believe is that as if cities have an opportunity, because they've got local governance, to put in their own transparency and data governance laws that yourself and Wilf are talking about, at which point then they've got a digital perimeter in which they can start employing the laws, and then they can start owning their data to actually then train artificial intelligence at a level they've never been able to do before, with the public trust, because they're seeing how their data is being used. So that's a wonderful initiative. And please put in the chat where people can find out about that GCT initiative. That would be great. Yuri, thank you for being patient. So Yuri, you mentioned digital twin. I know that you're passionate about supercomputing and modeling, how this can help, and you kind of alluded to that. Would you like to go a little bit deeper about your view on how important simulation and supercomputing is for cities and regions to pivot into new services as part of pandemic resilience?
Yeah, and it's an interesting point in the sense that a little bit of context, right? If you look at digital cities and smart cities, there's a sort of a macro change going on. Historically, the sanitation department didn't talk to the transportation department, who didn't talk to the power department, who didn't talk to the food and services, right? They were pretty stovepipe departments, able to do their own jobs, work with their own vendors, work with their own standards. But as we're going to, the world of convergence, of industrial Internet of Things, software is now cross-connecting all of these very disparate systems, which have had very historically different viewpoints, operations, terminology, and execution. And it's not a straight, so first that's going on, and that's really falling upon cities and regions to manage, right? I mean, there's not a just standing body that says, like, Apple builds their own environment of apps and makes sure everything it works there. There's no equivalent of that in terms of cities and regions and states. So that's sort of an emerging challenge that's hyper complex, very dynamic. It's affected by everyday operations. Our goal from a NASA point of view at looking at improving multimodal transportation is to sort of understand those dynamics, because it affects every different department. And it's really, and we've brought it up in the smart cities work, you almost need an operating system for the city to handle the services and applications. And how to design that, we're looking at digital twins to build test beds and prototypes, right? Because you don't want to try your first shot on the actual public. You'd like to be able to do millions of different scenarios, different runs, different parameters and balancing, and to find the best configurations of interactions of systems, what types of services. One of the things that NASA engineers love to do, and it's a part of good safety, is to test to failure, right? We want to know what the operating limit is of a certain function, or what the strength of a steel component is in a system. Well, we want to do the same thing with urban cities and services. Run those operations to the failure point. That tells us how far are we from the edge, what kind of margin do we have, what kind of resiliency we need. And we're looking to build our modeling and simulation services that municipalities could use, right? So we want to use crowdsourcing and open source applications and environments, allow the city managers and regions to apply and use our and the community's supercomputing facilities to run these simulations and to learn from each other, right? So there's a lot of potential cross-learning that could happen that's not normally easy to do. So building those environments and those partnerships to make it easy to share, to find out what's the best way to build, multiple sensors for your light poles to interact with your transportation system or your emergency services systems. Who's got a neat way of handling those aspects? And then also, we all have the challenge on bandwidth and communications, right? We have a ton of systems that want to communicate, but the bandwidth and the understanding of how to optimize that very critical resource, I think can benefit from a lot of modeling, simulations, and sharing of that information. So we're just starting to do that. It's a little bit difficult for NASA because we're used to just dealing with industry, manufacturers of aircraft, but using the global cities environment and interacting in that much larger space has made it easier for us to now move to a much wider audience. It's the entire nation and potentially globally, because everybody has transportation challenges and smart city operational capability. So sort of building that global digital world to reflect the operations and then to be able to do all sorts of different explorations and extrapolations to different scenarios, including pandemics and floods and earthquakes and applying that. So I think there's a real opportunity for the community to, where you couldn't afford it on your own, but as a partner, you can plug into a much larger space of capabilities and operations.
Yeah, I think you've hit the money on the head. That's absolutely the nail on the head. I think that's absolutely brilliant, Yuri. Thank you. And one of the things, audience, is that, Gene's aware of this, is that we announced together a computing AI smart city cluster probably about 18 months ago, Gene, wasn't it? And that's there, that's being put there, ready for this kind of solution, for this kind of challenge in society that Yuri's talking about, as a vehicle for cities to actually model and get things right before they invest in solutions and actually infrastructure. And that's why, to Will's point, is that the data governance is so important, because if we want to have the public trust to have access to that data in order to do the simulation, then we need to put certain things in place, like Gene's 4 Ps. And that's absolutely fantastic. So let's just take a question, if that's okay. And if you just unmute yourselves, and basically we can take that in any order who wants to do it. I'm going to take a question from Stan, because this is a quite unusual but an important question, which is about the mental health as part of well-being resilience. And what Stan seems to be alluding to is that he's talking about biodiversity, which, to your point, Wilf, is about the circular economy to a large extent. But let's talk about mental health. And if anybody wants to kind of chip in here, how do we bring well-being of mental health into smart cities and part of pandemic resilience? Has anybody got any thoughts on that?
Well, there is. Go ahead, Gene.
No, you go ahead.
So there's been some really interesting work going on. I think Stan's probably alluding to some of this. We've been working recently with the NHS in Scotland. I'm sure you know about this, Matthew, on things like the livability index, which takes into account considerably more factors than GDP. And there are other efforts looking specifically at that. What is the measure of a society's value that's not simply GDP, and starts to bring in those other factors? I think this gets to the root of what our objective is with smart cities. And when Gene talks about the 4 Ps, I don't think it's just, I think people-centric and partnerships, these are all issues associated with where we want this to go. This is not a financial measure. This is about livability and the value of society from the perspective of how do we make us all the best we can be? How do we make us all, put us all in a position where we can be valuable? I think this pandemic, particularly to the mental health issue, has shown some fragility in our society, right? That we need to be more connected. That the forcing of us into these sort of bubbles has sort of highlighted a problem that's already there. That we're not really engaging society properly. We're not making an environment in which we can all contribute well. Right? Things like the imbalance of wealth in our society tends to isolate sections of the society, push them to the edge. The systemic racism, and it's not just the United States, right? As usual, we're on the leading edge of some of this stuff. But this is, we see sectarian violence, we see racial violence, we see social violence going on in different communities because we see these separations. And I think that if we can focus smart cities on those 4 Ps, inclusion, giving people agency through their own privacy, making them feel like they have some value, they bring data, they bring a personality with them. I think that could be hugely beneficial. To one of the points that came from the earlier statements on privacy, I was just watching the tick go by. Technology cannot solve our problems, right? Technology is a tool to help us be more effective at achieving our goals, and those goals can be good and bad. We can create a data infrastructure in which it is possible for us to have agency over our own data and for us to be able to have privacy. But it requires a governance and a legislation that is as effective as our real world governance and education. Right? Exactly right. I have agency in my own home because the law allows me to claim that if somebody breaks my door down and comes in, that's illegal. Yes. If we don't have that in the virtual world, if people can just walk all over our data and look at it, we can't define that as illegal. There's no point at which they broke the door down. If the data's everywhere and everybody has it, there is no privacy. So we have to understand how to create the society we want and then use technology to help us implement it in a way that works for us all. So, things like GDPR are critical in this. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's great. So I actually want to kind of keep this conversation going, if that's okay. So what I believe, Will, and is in the book Inventing World 3.0, is once we create that foundation in the data world of trust, truth, and transparency that you're talking about, then we have a platform in which we can then train AI to actually are doing a lot of the heavy lifting and automation. But also, I believe that we can actually start creating personalized AI as we start bringing all the data that we own that's fractured in different systems back into one vault, in order to actually then start training our personal AI to guide us, but not to manipulate us, but to support us in our life experiences. Then I think we're onto something really powerful in society. So I really enjoyed what you were saying. That's absolutely wonderful. So let's keep going. Gene,
Matthew?
Oh, sorry, Yuri, go on, and then we'll go back to Gene. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Yuri.
I just wanted to circle back a little bit to the mental, state and health kind of challenges, right? I really think that we should consider where we are in terms of the spectrum of technologies in this area. I would argue, our social media tools today, I would compare them to sort of the telegraph compared to where we should be, the TV, right? So, I have 2 sons. They're both now home because the schools, they're not allowed to go to school. So you can really see the social gap that's been created, right? My youngest can't play sports, right? They're really looking forward to that. And my oldest just started the first year in college and had a whole bunch of friends, can't interact with them. So I really think there's a missing part, of really trying to augment, sort of these communities, right? As Wilfred said, that they get isolated. We really need social media tools to help bring, local streets and neighborhoods, connecting them. If we can't do it physically, then attempt to do that virtually, really. And both as a social leisure interaction, but then for services and health and security. So I think there's increased investment that needs to be done in that area to really uplift our level of functioning. You know, we kind of threw the schools to the wolves, right? You know, overnight they had to go virtual, right? I mean, and I don't think anybody felt that that was a smooth and 100% equivalent level of education and interactions, right? I think people across the country are struggling to get that same quality or better. So I think there's a lot of room there still to improve our interactions, both for education, but also for business and work.
Yeah, I agree. And that goes back to Will's point around the gig economy, right? I mean, Gene, how do these rural communities where people are moving, you know, I'm in Colorado, and there's lots of rural towns here, and people are moving out the cities into rural areas, running their businesses, right? I mean, you're very passionate about the rural areas. You know, can you talk more about in rural areas and this whole subject that Yuri's talking about is how do we create the threads of community again?
Yeah, I think it is very difficult in rural areas, as you may guess, as Yuri's kind of given a great view, and Will on kind of the broader issues on mental health. But with rural communities, one of the issues is capacity. You know, so a lot of rural communities, if you're the economic director, you're also maybe the communications director. You know, so you have those pieces to work on. So you have maybe more stressors because you have to have a broader run. You have kind of, I would say, in some cases, not economic resiliency. You have where you need to improve your workforce development plan. You know, all of these kind of work into the rural areas. And I think that rural areas have great potential for, say, the new workforce to move to them, to have a more higher quality of life. Because if everyone goes to the cities as has been planned, you know, the quality of life tends to go down because it's hard to deal with enough people with the services. So, you know, I think there's a transition. On mental health, I did want to mention that we are starting a new action cluster on mental health that Neil Broyles is running, and he talked about it yesterday. And we have the top groups in mental health in the US involved. However, we want to think about how smart technologies fit. So for example, where you have sensors that are looking at air pollution, noise pollution, light pollution, you know, things that do have stressors for mental health, what can be done and how do we look at it? So they're looking for some city partners and some, Will, maybe I can talk you into it. But some city partners and also some technology partners who can say, okay, this is something, you know, we haven't done. I mean, it's clear that, you know, more websites are needed. We need, you know, privacy and all the privacy pieces that Will was talking about and Matthew was talking about all come together. So, you know, whether you're urban or rural, those fit. And I think for rural, there's special challenges, but I do think that every community has to look at this as something, how do we frame it? And I think in the smart cities environment, we can try to look at it differently. And that's what I'm hoping we can do.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Gene. And, you know, the work you're doing in rural areas is great. You know, guys, I believe that data will become a new digital citizen. And I know that many others do. I think that artificial intelligence will become a new digital citizen. And that ties into what Wilf, Yuri, and yourself are seeing, Gene. And there's a lot of work to do, isn't there, Wilf, in this data world to create digital democracy that reflects the democracy in the physical world. We have a question from Timothy Herwig, which is about investment. And I'm going to open this up to the panel again. And what's the role of capital investment, either by public or private institutions, in investing in smart cities and kind of this new pandemic resilience that we've all been talking about? Does anybody have any views on the role of investment?
I guess
again, this time it's your turn, Gene. Go ahead.
Quick off the way. I guess from the federal perspective, we think that R&D funding is very important. National Science Foundation does a terrific job on that. They do cyber physical systems. They do ones on smart cities and communities where they really want the university and the industry partners to work with. Nice cat, Yuri.
Yeah.
To work together. And So I think that's important. We also have national labs that have a lot of resources, but what I do see in funding from the federal level is we have a lot of great research, but we aren't always great at transition to practice. So I do think that that's something that we should work on in terms of the areas that we go in. In terms of capital investment, you know, I see a lot of companies like the National Grid saying how they can, like they're working with Schenectady on smart street lighting, but also what are all the other functions that those poles could do for smart cities, public Wi-Fi, sensors, you name it. But the idea is they're investing in one community so that they can then scale up. And I think that and have options for scale and options for community. So, you know, that I think we need to have both private and public, and then connectivity. Of course, the FCC is putting a lot of funding into connectivity funds right now, especially in rural areas. But anyway, that's just a quick over the top. I'll pass it over to you, Will.
Yeah, no, I can build on that too. I agree with you. Public-private partnerships are a really interesting space to explore. I don't think we've done a particularly good job of figuring out how to do that well. There, you know, even here in Portland, we've recently had to change legislation to allow governments and private equity to work together on low-income housing, for example. There were actually laws against it, and for good reason, right? Because that kind of development can be fraught with insider knowledge that that can create corruption. So we have these rules to separate our government from our private entities for good reason. We need to be very careful about how we restructure some of these financing paths so as they are fair and equitable. They're not that they do what we want them to do. And I think that's critically important, particularly now. I think there are huge benefits to properly structuring. And I think there are challenges on both sides, and we need to be willing and able to talk about those challenges. And let me give some examples. I think many of the city investments we make have systemic returns, and systemic returns are better gained by government, right? They're better done collectively by us all. And some obvious examples: if we invest in a light rail system, the land around the light rail stations goes up in value, and the cost of the light rail system is probably higher than the ticket returns that light rail creates. It's good for society. It's a very hard investment for any private equity to make, because the money that is being generated by that investment is not going to the people building the railway line. It's going to the people buying the land around the railway stations. And that's the danger of some of these, is that if elected officials were to buy the land and then to put the railway line in at the cost of the citizens, that is considered abuse. But actually, societally, it's really important we figure out how to get this right, and we push the money into the right places, because that kind of collective investment in things that improve society at a systemic level are the kinds of investment we desperately need to make right now. And we've got to figure out how to do it and get the value capture correct, so as you get rewarded for the actions that you take and the investments that you make, but you don't get unfairly, biasedly rewarded because somebody else made an investment that you capitalized on. And I think we have to have some very direct discussions about value capture and about how to structure those deals. So as one, we can pull private equity into these structures, and two, we can be more direct about our governance in addressing some of the social problems that desperately need social answers. For example, how do you make a private equity investment in the homeless? You know, I have no idea at the moment. It's desperately needed. It would be good for society broadly to solve this problem. But you know, if we block the mechanisms that we have, like paying taxes to solve that problem won't get solved, and that damages society in the broad. So public-private partnerships, I think, are particularly tricky and desperately necessary, and we've got to figure out how to solve these problems.
Yeah, so before we get on to Yuri, because I know Yuri's got something to say, it feels to me as if there's two big things here you're talking about, Will. One is about how do we create an ethical foundation in society where there's accountability and transparency. But you kind of touched on opportunity zones and around social inequity. So Yuri, I'm going to put this on to you now around investment, but also if you can speak to opportunity zones, that will be quite great as well, please.
Sure. I was going to start on just NASA started their urban air mobility as a private-public partnership, right? And we are aware of sort of the challenges there, but one of the things we really like about that aspect is it sort of does two things. It keeps the research and development community honest, in my opinion, right? It makes sure that we just don't build our own ivory tower items of interest and then try to throw it over the fence. You know, having that public investment and private investment there together make sure that it's well formulated for the market. It's leveraging the intelligence of the VCs and that larger community. So it's I think a real-time good balance for making sure that as the government's making R&D investments, that it's well aligned, connected, and designed for implementation into the very competitive and dynamic market space. So I think that's a benefit. But like Wilfred said, that you've got to, again, I think look at the larger picture. I think that's why one of the things we're worried about is, we could enable greater throughput with urban air mobility, but then create greater congestion at the points that we're delivering it to, right? So a poorly designed system, not considering the neighborhoods and the multimodal throughput, could create downstream bottlenecks that are worse than the problem you were trying to solve in the first place. So really having that holistic view, ethics, that's not a simple parameter today, right? When I run portfolio analysis scenarios and simulations, I can't just plug, I know what the value of a gallon of gasoline is or a ton of CO2, but there is no easy value that I can pick from OMB or anywhere else from some standard that says, well, here's the ethical value of enabling this neighborhood to get light rail put in first versus some other neighborhood getting it, 2 years later, right? So those values and insight and understanding do need, I think, more research and development to be able to apply those, especially where we're using machine learning and AI and data mining to extract answers. Without those factors applied, you can get very, disconnected and unanticipated outcomes that you don't really want to go down that path.
That's great. Thank you very much, Yuri. And so I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So I think it'd be great for us to go around the table, maybe within a minute or so, and kind of just answer two things briefly. What's your vision for the new normal? What do you think the new normal will look like for the citizen? And also, I'm going to put this in as well. What do you think the role of artificial intelligence is in the new normal? So I'm going to start off with Jean. And if you can do it in about a minute, that'd be great, Jean, or something like that.
Okay, timing. So I think in the new normal, we are going to still have to be adaptable and have partners. I think that, if you think you're going to have everything planned out, we'll make a mistake. But I think what we found in responses here for recovery for COVID is that those partnerships that smart regions have enabled them to move quickly where they couldn't. So I think the new normal has to be based on kind of that interrelationships. I do think the points that you brought about data, everybody's brought about data hubs, and we have a whole state group working on data hub interoperability and better decision making. I think that kind of, if something else comes up, we can handle situation awareness much better, tracking all those kind of issues. I have to say that I am very excited about some of the new technologies, but I would like to see, some telepresence so that blue collar workers can work from home too. I mean, I'd like to see a vision where people, we have a problem, we can adapt, and we can work I do think, and I know this is one of the big issues for NTI, is connectivity has to be the base. If we don't have connectivity, then I don't see the new normal happening. So I think we have to really start at basics.
Thank you very much, Jean. Wilf, over to you. And you're muted. Hold on, I think I've been unmuted. Wilf.
You're muted.
Well, it just wouldn't come off mute. There we go. I apologize. I think we've started to see the interconnectedness of things. I think the new normal needs to recognize that that actions we take have side effects that we need to address, and that's very difficult to do. We like to see cause and effect. We like to be direct. We like to just build your building and move on. But there are complex interrelationships, and when we think about the communities that we're in, those can have the downsides can be as significant as the upsides and unintentional. The benefit of a smart city is that we can be more intentional. We can build virtual cities. I thought Yuri was talking earlier, and it brought to mind the shift. Maybe the most stark shift for anybody who's been in software. The shift from waterfall planning to agile planning, and the fact that that we can move much more quickly and much more effectively if we prototype things, test them, see if they work, adjust, and move forward, rather than this idea of designing monoliths that we then drop. And the number of examples is extraordinary. My father was an architect and loved some of the work of people like Le Corbusier, who built these beautiful structures that were pretty much unlivable. And so I think that this idea that things are systemic and using data to allow us to iterate very rapidly towards solutions that work across the community. Let me hand it back.
Thanks, Wilf. Yuri, over to you for a minute, and then I'll close it all up.
Yeah, I think the world's going to accelerate really fast, right? I think the difference will be as stark as going from agriculture to the Industrial Revolution and coal, providing power to do amazing things. I think AI will be a critical element of that to both provide safety and optimization and not going in the wrong direction. So, really sort of the digital consultants for each individual and optimizing their ability to get the most out of life. But those are critical. I don't think we have enough research and development in that area to make sure that happens soon enough and well enough.
That's great, Yuri. So I think we need to close down now. So I'd like to thank Jean Rice from the NTIA. I'd like to thank Wilfried Pinfold, the CEO of Urban Systems, and you've just heard from Yuri Gordiak, a director at NASA. I'm Matthew James Bailey, author of Inventing World 3.0, which covers many of the topics that we've talked about. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, and we hope you, the panelists, have had a great time.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew. Okay, well, I'm really happy and thank